Hello everyone, so this is the final assignment for rendering graphics programming. For this assignment we had to create a scene, and we also had to implement some of the features that were provided to us in this rubric here. So I'm going to walk through the expected codes and elements and features of the code, and I'm first going to jump to the shaders and I'm going to use my demo class right here. So this is my demo class, and in my demo class I am creating the shaders that I'm using. I'm using the texture shader for the skybox, and I'm using the texture light and the color light, using multiple light sources for the objects that I'm going to have in the scene. And if I just go into my texture class, not the right thing, shader texture, there it is. As you can see, when I create it, I am assigning in the constructor, I'm using the texture.hlsl shader, which is right here. And this is not really using, this is the light one. I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong. Okay, yeah, this one right here. So here I'm defining the main texture, the sample, the camera data, and then the instance data. And these are our constant buffers. And then my visual vertex shader simply just takes in the position, and then the pixel shader. So that's that shader. And then we have the shader texture light multiple, and it takes in the texture light multiple shader, which is this one over here. And this one uses light, so it's going to have your ambient, diffuse, and specular for your materials, your fog illumination for the lights, and then it's going to compute the directional light, the spotlights, set those light parameters. And right now I have 3-point lights and 2 spotlights that this shader specifically can use to find the constant buffers here that I'm going to be using, and then also the fog data to set the range, the start when the fog will start to appear, and then the color of the fog. And then we're computing the point light, we're computing the directional light, and then we're computing the spotlight, the 3 different types of lights. And then here's our vertex shader passing in that data, and then in our pixel shader we're actually setting the colors for the lit color. And since this is not a texture, we're just passing in the ambient, diffuse, and specular for the lit color. And then for the fog, we are adding that fog element as well. So back here, I'm sorry, that was texture light. So in our texture light shader, we're actually using not color light, we're using texture light. I'm sorry. So in here it's the same thing, same general gist. The only key differences in this one is that I'm using 6-point lights and 2-point lights, because this is what I used in my final scene, which I will show later on. And the main difference here again is the vertex shader output. We're having the texture coordinate for the UV maps, and then in our pixel shader we are multiplying the texture sample with the ambient and diffuse and specular to get the overall lit color, and then also along with the fog, and then up in the texture over here in our constant buffer we have, we are defining the texture and the sample state. So that takes care of those shaders. And then here next I'm loading all the textures. Right now I'm just using the dice for a 6-faced cube, the crate face for a repeated texture cube, and then the brick for my sphere object, and then storm days, and then this is for my skybox. So now next I'm loading the models, and then when I load the models I am creating the unit box repeated texture, the 6-face texture, a box, the sphere, the pyramid, and then the unit box. And this can all be found in model tools, CP, or model tools. And here I'm creating the unit box, and the unit box, it doesn't have any of the UV coordinates or the normals. That's where the specific ones, like the repeated texture ones. In this one, I am defining the X, the Y, the Z coordinates, the UV for the texture, and then the normals, the normal X, the normal Y, and the normal Z for the light, and then the color. And I'm doing this for all the faces of the box. Then I'll also do it for the 6-face, set these, and then for the unit pyramid, I'm not using that because I'm using this updated version of it, which is the unit pyramid repeated texture, and it is also using UVs and the normals added to it as well. And then the sphere, I modified it so that it takes in the normals and the UVs and then assign those. So those are the pre-made models that I made. And the skybox, which I guess I could go over it right now. Yeah, the skybox is here, and it's in its own class, and basically it's just back face now, so that the texture is printed on the inside of the cube rather than the outside of the cube, and it's very similar to the 6-face cube. Let me just pin this. Okay, and then so yeah, I'm creating the skybox too, and now I'm using graphic objects, and I know that we're supposed to use graphic objects to correspond to shaders, colors, and their light versions. And so here I created the graphic object for the skybox, and it's a separate graphic object right here in the skybox. Where are you? Yeah. So, and it's just gonna hold that object. It's gonna hold the shader that it's using. And right now it's using shader texture because that's what skybox is mainly used, because we don't want to have light reflecting on the skybox. And then it has the model, the skybox model, and then the texture that it's going to use, and then its world matrix. And then the only methods that I really have are just set texture, set world, and render, which I don't really need to use that often because I'm just going to be setting it up anyways in my constructor, where I pass in the texture and or the shader that I'm going to use, the texture, and the size of the cube, size of the skybox. And right now I set it to 500. And right now I'm going to be focusing on the first shader, the color light multiple shader, which is a color shader that uses light, and it can use multiple lights. So right here I'm setting up the fog parameter for color light multiple, and I'm just gonna open that shader up right here in my shaders, color light multiple. Yeah. So yeah, so here I'm defining the shader, and I'm giving it the ambient diffuse and specular for fog illumination, the directional light, the point light and spotlight, and the camera matrices, the world and the material, and the inverse as well, and then the light parameters. And right here this one only has 3 point lights and 2 spotlights, like I mentioned earlier, and also again the fog parameters. This correlates to the HLSL file, shader file. So back to here, I'm defining the fog parameter. So I first need to set to context, and then I'm sending the fog parameters. This is going to be the start, and this is going to be the range, and this is going to be the color, which can be seen in here where I go down. Yeah, so I'm passing in the fog start, the fog range, and the fog color, and then I'm setting it to context. And then so that's the fog parameters, and then I'm passing in setting the directional light And here I'm only using the light direction and setting the ambient, diffuse, and specular. And then within that same shader, I'm also setting up the light parameters, the point light parameters for 3 of them. And right now I have one below the origin, one to the right of the origin, and one to the left of the origin, or one above the origin, one to the left of the origin. Okay, and then right now I'm creating the graphic objects that I'm going to be that are using the color light shader, the color light multiple shader, and this can be defined here in my graphic objects folder. Yeah, so right here it's just basically setting the material and then setting the world and then just rendering it. And I'm defining the color by using the diffuse parameter. So right now I'm defining the graphic object 1, passing in the shader and passing in the model, and this is just going to be the repeated box. And these are going to be the spotlights, which are going to be rotating around the cube. And this is the 6-face cube, and then this is a sphere, and this is a pyramid. And so I do the same thing for the other shader, for texture light multiple shader, which there's not too much of a difference. It uses this shader right here, the shader texture light, and in this one I have 6 point lights and 2 spotlights set in this one, and I'm setting the the world and material and the fog parameters very similar to the color version of this, and it has a corresponding graphic object, as you might have guessed. And the graphic object is very similar, except that now it also has a mesh for the textures to hold the textures, which the color object does not have. So yeah, you can set texture, and you can set texture based on the mesh number if you have a texture that has different meshes, and you can also do that for the color light multiple too. So here I can set the material for an object without a mesh number, and then set a material with the mesh number if you do have different meshes. And then it's basically setting the world, setting the material, setting the texture, and then rendering. And it's basically the same thing where I'm setting to context this shader that I'm going to be using, because I need to set to context in order to change the fog parameters. So I'm setting up the fog parameters, and then I'm setting up the directional light, and then the point light, and right now I'm just using 3 point lights, but I could use more for this specific one. And then I'm creating my graphic objects using the graphic object texture light multiple class, and I'm passing in the shader and the model that I'm using just like before, but the only thing that I'm doing different now is I'm setting the texture that I am using. And yeah, because setting material is just material. So I'm doing it all for the different pre-made models that I already created, are already defined above, and then I'm initializing the matrices. So all the objects that I'm going to be demoing are going to be centered at the origin, and then I'm going to have 2 spotlights rotating around it along the Y and X axis. And so here I'm setting the world matrices for these objects. And then in my update scene, I am rotating the world matrix. I'm rotating the spotlight, so I'm updating the world matrix. And then in my draw scene, I'm clearing the target view and clearing the depth stencil view. And this must be done every single time you do the draw scene, whenever you're about to draw. And then I'm using the texture shader, so I'm setting it to context. I'm setting the camera matrices, and then I'm rendering the skybox because it uses this texture. And then for the color light shader, I'm using this shader, so I have to set to context, and I have to send the camera matrices again. And then for the lighting to work, I have to send also the light parameters, and it's based on the camera position. So I'm sending the light parameters, and then I'm rendering the spotlight number 1. Well, not rendering. I'm defining spotlight number 1 and spotlight number 2. And here I am defining the light position, the range, the attenuation, the spot exponent, and the higher this gets, the more diffused it is. So it's, oh no, the higher it is, I'm sorry, the more concentrated it is. So moving on, I then am rendering graphic object 1 color, which is the box, and then I'm setting the world matrix for the objects that are going to be rotating around, the spotlights that are going to be rotating around the box, and then I'm rendering those as well. And then if I run this, we can see, and right now the color of the box is white, and the lights for both spotlights are yellow. Any second now. Okay, so now we have our skybox rendered, showing the inside, and right now we're inside and set to 500, so it's pretty big. And then we have the two color light objects that are using the color light multiple shader, multiple lights, and right now you can see there are 2 spotlights that are going around this cube, and the 3-point lights, we have one at the top, one at the bottom, and again one to the right, which is the red. And then we have those 2 spotlights, and right now you can kind of see the fog effect kind of working because these objects are scaled. The spotlights are scaled. You can already see them kind of graying out, but if we kind of zoom out, you can see the center object also getting grayed out too and having that fogged effect. So that's the box using the color light shader with multiple lights. Now next is the sphere. And again you can see the lights working, and we have the blue, the red, and the green all working on the sphere. And then we go on to the pyramid. And then we can see the light working on the pyramid, and then the point lights at the top and to the right and the bottom, and those lights working. So that is the color shader. Next I'm going to be going to the texture shader, and so I'm not rendering these, and now I'm just gonna, it's the same process again, defining the eye position for the camera and then sending those to the right shader, the texture light multiple shader, setting to context, setting the camera matrices. We have to do this whenever we use a new shader, rendering spotlight 1, rendering spotlight 2, and then here I'm going to render the spotlights and also render the repeated box so that you can see it working. Anytime. So yeah, now you can see the textured, it's textured, you can see the point lights working, you have one on the right, top, and bottom, you can see the spotlights working on this object, it's moving, and you can also see the gray effect, the fog effect with this shader. So that's the repeated texture. This is the 6-phase texture. And we can see the 6-phase texture with this dice. You can see it illuminated by the point lights, and then you can see it also being illuminated by the spotlights. And that is the 6-phase texture. And then the sphere, which will have a brick texture. and then you can see the sphere is textured with the blue, the red, and all the lights. Oh, and this one, the first spotlight is red and the second spotlight is yellow. So FYI. And then finally we have the pyramid textured object model. And here you can see I'm using the crate texture, and it's just, again, displaying that across this pyramid. So that takes care of some of the demos for the pre-made models, which I didn't quite use in my final scene, but I wanted to show them off because I did work on those. So here, my final scene, I am creating, again, the shaders that I'm going to be using right now. I'm just using texture light because I'm not really using the color shader that often, because I want it to look realistic. And then I'm using the texture shader for the skybox and texture light multiple for most of the other objects. So right now I'm loading all the textures in, the skybox and the train and the water, and then loading the models, the tower, the ship, the Reaper alien, the background aliens, the pole in the center, and then the spotlight. So here I already mentioned about the skybox, which I mentioned earlier. So I'm not going to go into that, but the creation of the terrain. Now for the terrain, I'm using a graphic object terrain class, and if I can find the graphic object terrain class right here, it uses the terrain model, which I have defined in my models right here. And the terrain model, if I can find it, there it is. The terrain model is just the model terrain, and the constructor takes in a height map, takes in the size of the terrain that you want it to be, and it takes in number of repeated textures that you want along the U and the V, and then the height, how high you want it to be. And then I added this delta H to like kind of lower it down if need be, so that creates the terrain. The terrain model is created within the terrain graphic object, and it uses the correct shader. And right now I'm just using the texture light multiple shader, and then it has its material and it has its world, and it's just setting texture, setting the material, setting the world, and since it's not going to have different meshes, it's only going to have one mesh, I left it without the mesh number. So here I'm defining the height map that I'm using, the shader that I'm using, the terrain, the texture that I'm using, the size of the terrain, which I'm going to have 300, and then the number of repeated textures that I want using this text terrain, which is just the grass, and so by 10 by 10, and then the height, the max height that I want it to be, and how lowered I want it to be, and so that creates a terrain. And water is again a terrain object too, and the terrain, and now it's going to be a lot lower, like the peaks are going to be a lot lower, and the size is going to be relatively the same. And then I'm defining the shader, but using a different height map file. Again, setting the fog lights, setting the direction lights, and then I have 6 point lights, and they're all yellow, and they're all meticulously arranged so that the lights of the main alien in the center of the scene lights up. And yeah, that took a lot of time. And then I'm creating the graphic objects, the tower, and again using the texture light multiple shader, define the shader, define the model like always. For the ship, the background reapers, the reaper in the center, the pole, the spotlight, and then defining the world matrices that I'm going to be using, where I want it to be positioned, if I want it to be rotated a little bit, but obviously not scale, because then the fog effect will not work as intended. And then I'm setting the world matrices, and then in my update scene, I'm updating the position of ship A and ship B, which are going to be rotating or flying around this alien reaper in the center, and then also rotating the red spotlight, which will shine around from the center across all the mountains in the scene, and then also the yellow spotlight coming from the Reaper that will be moving up and down this tower that you'll see soon enough. And so here in my draw scene, same stuff as always, and then I'm defining the skybox using the texture shader, setting to context, and then using the texture light multiple shader. I'm setting the shader, I'm rendering the terrain, rendering the water, defining the eye position for the light to work as effectively, and then rendering spotlight number 1, spotlight number 2, and then rendering all the graphic objects. And then if I run this, yeah, this might take a while. So here in my scene that is about to open up, start off from the center, and the first thing you can notice is this pole that's rotating the spotlight, which points a red light across the entire scene. So as you can see, that light is shining across the distant mountains and the tower. And here we have our main alien, which uses 6 point lights for each of those eyes, and they're very small and they're very bright. And then I have the spotlight comment that's kind of supposed to like imply that it's searching this building, so it's like moving up and down along this tower, and this tower is in this middle of the this island type scene that we have. We have the water with the different height maps, and then we have the mountains with that height map, the terrain, those 2 terrain objects. Then we have our 2 ships that are flying around that will be affected by the light coming from both spotlights. As you can see, it turns red. Maybe you can see it. Yep, see. So that is my graphic object, and I'm just going to make sure that that is everything that we need to cover. So we went over the skybox, the terrain, the pre-made models. Oh, and these were these were models that I used that were pre-made. Go back here. These were models that I used that were pre-made. And when I created those models, I defined the model that I was using, the Exul model, and the Reaper. The front Reaper uses multiple meshes, so when I was creating that object, I had to define the different mesh areas, and I had to give it its particular texture. So right here I'm defining set material for the first index and the second one. Same thing for the other Reapers. And oh, I forgot to mention, so as you can see in the background, you can see the aliens and the Reapers in the background, and you can kind of see the fog effect already taking place. But if I just zoom out even more, you can see the fog effect taking place a lot better. Everything is taking place pretty well, and that is that scene. And I think that's everything. We did use multiple light sources, 6-point lights and 2 spotlights. And the spotlights were all moving, and there were the objects, the ships that were moving. We went over the different pre-made models. Some of them I didn't use, some of them I did. Actually, none of the pre-made models I used in my scene, but I did show them in the demo. Didn't really use a flat plane because the terrain was basically much better to use in my sense. And they're all using the standard vertex. Standard vertex struct, which has positioned the UV for the texture, and then the normal, and then the color, and then the mesh number. and then we had our different pre-made models, and I specified them as a mesh, as you can tell. And then I created the terrain model class, had it appropriately scaled with the right UV mapping with specific repeats, the terrain class as well, the shader classes and the respective HSL files, and then the graphic object. And then I didn't use the mirror in my final scene. I used the fog instead, and it's more streamlined now. So again, seeing the final scene just as a wrapping up type of thing. We see the fog, we see the point lights, we just see the spotlights, we see the moving objects, we see the moving spotlights, we see the skybox, we see the terrain, we see the water, which is using the terrain model, and these are all pre-made models besides the terrain models and the skybox, and all using texture light multiple shader, and I think that is it for the final project. I enjoyed this class and it was very awesome. Learned a lot. Until the next one then, I guess.